All right, now we're going to perform the first step of any color correction workflow, and that is to adjust tonality. So go to Working Files, Projects, and then open up 1104 Adjusting Tonality. Now this is the color correction workspace, and I recommend you work inside here. At least make sure you have this reference monitor turned on with the YC waveform visible. Let's just take a look at the 4 clips we have here. This first one is provided by Digital Juice, and if you look over here at the waveform, you see that it is perfectly exposed. It goes from 0 to 100, a full dynamic range. So there's really no fixing needed here, but we might want to just touch it up a little bit by giving it just a little bit more contrast. Moving on down the line a bit here, we've got this clip that is seriously overexposed. You can see there's nothing down here, no blacks down here at all, nothing in the deep shade. Just kind of this dull gray look here where it should be darker. Then up here, it's a little bit too bright. No detail there in those top bright areas between 100 and 110. So we need to bring this guy down to fix it. Moving on down the line here, we have a clip that is seriously underexposed. See all this black area down here? All that black area is solid black. There's just no detail there at all. You can spot that there. You can't see any detail there. And we have no highlights either. So we need to lift this up and then expand it a bit to get some highlights. This last clip has a wide dynamic range, which would be unusual for any kind of shot that you would make with a typical camcorder, but there it is. It goes from less than 0, which means you have some areas here that are black and have no detail, and it goes above 100, so we've got some highlighted areas that have no detail either. So we need to bring the highlights down and the blacks up, and then perhaps adjust the contrast. Before we start doing this, I want to show you why we're not working with the fast color corrector to take care of all of the tonality fixes. Let me go back to the beginning here and go over to the clip that is kind of underexposed, this third one here. There you go. It's the underexposed clips that cause problems for the fast color corrector and the 3-way color corrector. Let me show you what I mean. I've got that clip selected. I can go to Effects, go down to my color correction group here, and double click on the fast color corrector. Well, that adds it to this clip. I just need to go to the Effect Controls panel, and there it is. And the fast color corrector and the 3-way color corrector both have these levels style controls. If you've worked with Photoshop, you've seen a levels effect where you've got these sliders plus a histogram here. You don't need a histogram here, you got a better thing. You've got this lovely YC waveform display. So when you have an underexposed clip like this, you need to lift the blacks. You need to lift the shadows to get them up here where you can see some details starting to show up. So to lift things that are too dark, you need to change the output. When something is too dark or too bright, you adjust the output. So we're taking the output up a little bit to raise that up to about 0, so you can begin to see some details in the darkest areas. You can't repair all clips like this. The detail won't necessarily show up there, but you can be absolutely certain there'll be no detail if it's down below 0. Okay, now we need to lift the highlights. When you're working with the dark areas and they're above 0, then you need to use the input. And you're working with bright areas that are below 100, you also adjust the input. So we need to lift the input here to bring those highlights up a bit, something like that. And when we start doing that, we begin pushing the blacks back down a bit. So let's adjust the output just a touch there to get them just a touch through that little 0 IRE line. Okay, now we're effectively done here, but if we want to adjust the midtones, maybe adjust the contrast a little bit, this is where problems arise in these levels style controls in the fast color corrector and the 3-way color corrector. I'm going to move this gray level slider, sometimes called gamma or midtones, and once I start moving it, watch what happens over here inside the YC waveform monitor. You're going to see this trace. The green area is called a trace. And the trace is going to suddenly jump up to the output level. So let me just move it a little bit. Here we go. And bam, it jumps up. And that's not good. What's happening here is all on the bottom here, those blacks have all been smashed in the one small little area, which is not good. You want to have some kind of distribution here. Let me just move that down now. I'm going to take the output down to bring them down. But you see it's a line there on the bottom? That means all the blacks have been shoved into that one little line. And they're just black, black, black. No matter where you put them, they're just going to be dark. And that's not a good thing. You don't want to smash everything in the one little line like that. And that's a problem when you've got underexposed clips working with these levels style controls in the fast color corrector and the 3-way color corrector. It's just one of those little anomalies that makes me think that it would be best to work with the Luma Curve, which doesn't do this. Also, I like that we're going to work with the Luma Curve because it works differently than these sliders. So I think you can see how the sliders work, but now we're going to shift over to the Luma Curve. So let me go up here and delete this effect. Click on Fast Color Corrector plus Delete, and it's gone, and we'll revisit this clip a little bit later. Let me go back to the first clip, pressing the Home key, slide it a bit so you can see what we're looking at here. As I mentioned, this clip doesn't need any fixing, but let's adjust the contrast just a little bit. So I'm going to select it to make it active, go to Effects, go down here to Luma Curve, and double-click on Luma Curve, and that adds it to the clip. Go back to Effect Controls, and there it is, this little graph here. Now you saw us deal with the level styles controls before, where we made things go up or down. Well, down here, if we want to lift the blacks, for example, we would slide this up and that would lift the blacks. If you want to bring the blacks down, we would pull it to the right. Now they won't go down much here. They'll smash into the 0 line in this case. If we want to lift the highlights, we would drag it to the left up here on top. If we want to drop the highlights, we'd pull them down here like that. That's how the Luma curve effect works. So what I want to do is I want to adjust the contrast. Well, the steepness of the line determines the contrast. If it's steeper, in other words, it goes up like this more than like this, then there's more contrast. I'll show you what I mean. If I pull this down and pull this up, you're going to see that the contrast kind of goes away. It gets all washed out, which looks horrible, of course. I'm going to go Control or Command Z to undo those two things. So instead, I want to create a slightly steeper curve. And this is an absolutely standard procedure that people use all the time in products like Photoshop and in video editing products like Premiere Pro. You just add a little point up here just by clicking and then drag it up ever so slightly just to make it a little bit brighter on the top. So the highlights are just being a little bit brighter, not a lot. Then you add a point down here in the bottom to make the blacks, the dark areas, the shadows, just a little bit darker. And now you see the curve is a little bit steeper like this, and the contrast is increased. It makes the clip look a little richer. And now you can adjust the overall brightness by clicking in the middle, here in the midtones of the gammas, and just pulling these guys up or down to suit your taste. And lots of times you look here at the YC waveform to see if you're spreading out the dynamic range of the luminance, just to make sure you've got kind of a full spread. Now, not all clips have a full spread. You can see this area here, the sort of high end of the midtones. There really aren't any values there, but it's not necessary that you try to put values there. Nevertheless, that's kind of the goal, depending on the shot you've got. So that is the way you can add a little bit of contrast. Just lift the highlights, drop the shadows, and maybe adjust the midtones if necessary. All right, let's move on to the next clip. Next clip is seriously underexposed. Let's look at that. I'll click on it to make it selected or make it active. We want to be able to apply the Luma curve to this. So go over to Effects, double click on Luma curve to add it. It's been added. Now we go over there and take a look at it. There it is. Now we're going to fix this. The general workflow when you're dealing with luminosity is to deal with the blacks first, the shadows. So you need to pull the shadows down to 0. Pull the shadows down in the Luma curve, you need to slide the Luma curve down to the bottom to the right. If you think that this way is up, then the right must be down. So I'm going to pull it to the right and watch those guys go down inside the YC waveform. We're bringing it down to 0. The lowest part just touches the 0 line. Now we need to drop the highlights down to the 100 line. Well, if you look at the highlights up here, left is up, and down is, well, down, right? So we'll pull this thing down a little bit to the 100 line. Get the highlights just touching the 100 line there, right along there, 100 IRE. And now we're set. We can adjust the contrast if we want. So you can add a little point here, lift it up ever so slightly. Add a point here and bring it down ever so slightly. And if you want to adjust the overall brightness, the contrast here in the middle, you can pull this up or down depending on your taste as you try to spread out the trace here in the YC waveform. All right, that's that one. Let's move on down the line to the underexposed clip. You can tell it's underexposed by looking at the YC waveform, seeing that you've got all kinds of stuff here below the 0 line. All that black area there is solid black. There's no detail at all. I'll show you that by zooming in on it, going, let's say, 200%, scrolling out up to the shadows there, maybe even going farther to 400%. Going through that shadows again here, scrolling up a little bit, and all you have is black. There's no detail whatsoever. I'm going to try to see if I can fix that a little bit. So I'm going to click on this clip to select it, go over to the effects, double click on Luma curve. We've added Luma curve to this clip now. Go to effect controls. And let's just see if we can add a little bit of detail. Now, when it's that horribly underexposed, there may be no detail to reveal, but we'll get some back, I think. So use the Luma curve here to lift up the blacks like that until you get to the 0 line. Now notice when I lifted the shadows, it did get a little more detail there. I'll go Control or Command Z. Pretty much black there now. I'm going to lift it up and suddenly some details will appear. So there are some details there in the black that we've now revealed by lifting this up. And if you looked at the level styles control and didn't think they were that intuitive, here, this is very intuitive. Either you can lift things up from the bottom, drop things from the top, or lift them at the top, or drop them at the bottom. And you can see that kind of intuitively here in the graph. Let me go back to Fit. There you go. And now let's deal with the highlights, the top end. We need to lift the highlights. So up here at the top, obviously if we pull it down, it would be the wrong direction. So left is up in this case. Lifting the highlights, getting off to about 100, and you begin to see little traces touching the 100 line there, but those guys are not so big that they're going to be blowing things out. And there's probably not much detail in there anyways because it's such a small object that's illuminated here. The bright spots are probably the shorts and maybe that little pole back there. So we can lift it up a little bit more just so we get enough touching the 100 line to spread out the display here a bit. And now we can adjust the contrast again. You click here, lift it up just a little bit, click here, drag it down a little bit. Let's say you add a point here and you drag it and you go, you know, I really didn't need to put that thing there. It really is unnecessary. The way you get rid of a point here is just by grabbing it and pulling it to the left all the way, or pulling it to the right all the way, or lifting it all the way to the top. That's how you get rid of one of those guys. Okay? So you can put this thing on here and lift it up a little bit, or pull it down a little bit, depending on what we think is right. I think pulling it left, lifting it a bit is probably better. All right, let's move on to the last clip. This clip has a wide dynamic range. Goes from deep, deep blacks, where there's no detail at all right there, probably right there inside the trees. This little spot here on the right corresponds to that spot on the right. And then the highlights are too bright here again. The shorts there probably are too bright white, and that post back there, and maybe this little part of the sign is showing up over here. You see those little highlights there? Too darn bright. So we need to fix this. I click on the clip to make it active or selected. Go over to Effects. Double click on Luma Curve. There we go. We've now added it to that clip. Go back to Effect Controls. There it is. So the work order here is deal with the black areas, the shadows first, and then worry about the highlights second. So we're going to lift the shadows a bit, lift the blacks, get them up to 100 IRE. See how simple this is, folks? You see how easy it is to work with the scopes now to make this thing look just right. Now we need to bring the highlights down a bit, a little too bright. Drop them down just a skosh there, right about there. And now we ask ourselves, you know, how do we want to deal with the brightness values in the middle? Let's start up by adding a little bit of contrast. Click there, a little bit brighter. Click here, a little bit darker, not much. And click in the middle to say, I think it's probably a little too bright. I'm going to bring it down just a little bit like that. There we go. And now we're done. So that's how we adjust tonality. That's the first step in the color correction workflow. And it may be the last step. Adjusting tonality may be all you need to do. The colors will look fine after you adjust the tonality. But if there's still a color cast, then you move on to the second step, and that is to deal with the color or the hue.